In this video, we'll be talking about ectopic pregnancy. So ectopic pregnancy simply means where pregnancy happens in an offbeat location. So generally the implantation of the fertilized egg or the blastocyst happen in the uterine cavity in the endometrial lining. But in this case, the implantation happens somewhere else. So the most common site for awkward implantation is the fallopian tube. And it accounts for about 95% cases of the ectopic pregnancy. And in 5% cases, implantation site is other than the fallopian tube. So in the fallopian tube, the most common site is the ampulla. 70% of the cases is basically ampullary implantation. Fimbrial implantation is a bit rare. 11% of the cases are fimbrial implantation. Then there is isthmic implantation, which kind of accounts for 12% of the cases. Then interstitial implantation is very rare, and in rarest of the rare occasion, the implantation can happen in the cervix as well. And in some classical cases, almost negligible implantation can also happen in a scar tissue outside the uterus as well, but that's ultra rare. Question is, what is the cause of this ectopic pregnancy? Why does implantation happens elsewhere where they are not supposed to be? So let's dig deep in. So let's talk about the normal implantation process in order to understand how things go wrong. So here we are looking at the uterus. Here is the ovary. Here is the uterus. Here is the cervix. Here is the vagina. Here is the fallopian tube and the three locations of the fallopian tube. Here is the fimbria, the finger-like projections, the ampulla, and the isthmus. So let's look at the process of implantation. So before that, you can understand that ovulation would happen from the ovary. The egg would travel through the fimbria towards the ampulla. In the ampulla and isthmic junction, there would be fertilization. After that, there would be 2-cell stage, 4-cell stage, 6-cell stage, and eventually the blastocyst would form. Blastocyst would go and travel towards the uterine cavity, where the implantation would happen in the uterine wall, in the endometrial lining. So this is the normal process of implantation, and this is abrogated in ectopic implantation. So there are a couple of risk factors that can really increase the risk of ectopic pregnancy. One of the most prevalent one is basically history of pelvic inflammatory disease, in vitro fertilization, use of intrauterine devices, tobacco smoking, tubal surgery, or sometimes previous history of the ectopic pregnancy. All these can account for a round of ectopic pregnancy. Now in the ectopic pregnancy, the blastocyst implantation happens in the awkward location, right? But what's the big deal about it? Remember, when the blastocyst is implanted, it leads to establishment of the blood connection. Now before that, you have to understand that why does blastocyst cannot reach to the uterine cavity? Because it could be a motility problem in the fallopian tube itself. There are cilia, hair-like projections all over the fallopian tube cells which propel the blastocyst towards the uterine cavity. In many cases, this function is altered or not adequate. And that is how the blastocyst gets slowed down and indeed gets implanted into the fallopian tube instead of the uterine cavity. Now in normal pregnancy, what happens is when the blastocyst is implanted, it establishes connection with the endometrial lining and it ruptures the spiral artery to establish blood connection and ensure nutrient exchange. Now same thing, if you think about the context of the fallopian tube lining, one can understand the cytorofoblast would try to establish the connection, but there are no spiral arteries because it's not the endometrial lining. So obviously things that get ruptured is basically the fallopian tube epithelial cells. And as a result, if the fallopian tube is ruptured, it would lead to huge inflammation, blood loss, and chance of further infection. That lead to severe cramp, abdominal pain, vaginal bleeding, and especially it would lead to many other uncomfortable situations. Now, symptoms may progress to hypervolemic shock if the rupture and if there is too much of blood loss that happened. So all these factors are important to consider. Now, the diagnosis happens generally via transvaginal ultrasound. So if the implantation is in ectopic site, that can be monitored in the USG report. Also, serum beta HCG level is another good biomarker. Maybe the lower than expected expected HCG in the gestational age is an indicative of ectopic pregnancy. So most of the cases, surgical interventions are required, especially in the cases when the fallopian tube is ruptured. Laparoscopy and laparotomy is one of the ways by which it can be terminated. In case of open rupture of the fallopian tube, open surgeries might be required. But if it is mild and it's not rupturing the fallopian tube, in this case, methotrexate and folic acid antagonist can actually block the progression of this ectopic pregnancy. Remember, folic acid and methotrexate both are important for dividing cells. In the embryo, cells are mostly dividing. So when these drugs are provided, all the dividing cells would be severely affected and embryo would not divide to give rise, the embryonic cells would not divide to give rise to other germ layers. So this is how ectopic pregnancy can be terminated. So I hope this video was useful. If you like this video, give it a quick thumbs up. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. See you in next video.